So this is the book, and that's the very famous photograph of Hilma af Klint when she was about 40 years old, and it's her in her studio. And I think it's a good point to start with because it shows Hilma af Klint, who's then a trained artist, also of some reputation in Stockholm. And it's interesting how she poses. She doesn't really pose as an artist with an easel in front of a painting, but what she does, she shows herself in the studio with her head in her hand, and she poses as a thinker. And I think this is pretty much also how she thought of herself, not only as an artist, but also as a thinker, as an author, as a writer. And sometimes I'm asked, sort of in a nutshell, what is she? Who is she? And I'm sort of tempted to say that she is a fabulous artist, fabulous painter, but she's also a revolutionary mystic, and she is also a queer futurist, and we'll hear more about it. And it's also interesting how she arranges things in her studio. You can see there is a tulip in a vase on her table, and the tulip is fading. And then there is a picture of one of her ancestors, her grandfather, in the background, who was a cartographer, which is also has a lot of meaning for her. He was a Navy officer and a cartographer, so he would sort of look through the waters and to see the invisible in the waters and chart it. So that's something that she strongly connects to. So you have this arrangement of the tulip, her ancestor, and herself. So something that's decaying, someone who has already deceased and who's dead, and herself. And so you have a circle of life and death there, and that's also something that is important to her. So I'll start with the first chapter, which is about sort of a little bit of her background, her training in Stockholm, Hilma af Klint as a painter. So that's a beautiful photograph of the young Hilma af Klint in a very classic posture, here posing in a studio with an easel and with a palette and brushes. And in Stockholm, you had a very extraordinary situation because women were allowed to study at the official royal art academies. There were some private academies already in Europe where women were allowed to study, but in Stockholm, also the Royal Academy allowed them in. And Hilma af Klint belonged to the second generation who was allowed to study. And she was actually a very good student. She got prizes while she was studying, and she also got a fellowship later on. So she did very well at the academy. Here we have a beautiful small drawing from her sketchbook, which she has done during a class. So male and female students were trained separately. And this is a view of Hilma af Klint looking at some of her fellow female students. And the big scandal why women weren't allowed to visit the academy was because the academies would teach students to draw from life and also to draw from nudes from life. And people thought that this is not appropriate for women to learn and not appropriate for women to do, because they didn't want dressed women to study undressed men. But this is actually what happened. Hilma af Klint, this is also a drawing by her, did also nude studies of almost undressed men, and that's sort of for most of European academies that was unthinkable. And also in Stockholm, it remained contested. It wasn't like everybody was happy that the women were there. There was a lot of agitation against that, but still they were allowed to study and they could acquire these skills. Hilma af Klint was, as I said, a very fine student, and I bring here one of her early academic paintings. It's a quite bad picture because unfortunately this painting was bought not so long ago and showed up at an auction and then vanished. So we only have a very small picture of this from the auction catalog that was given to me by Johann af Klint, one of Hilma af Klint's descendants from the af Klint family. And the funny thing is that this is a very classic theme, Andromeda, usually the story goes that she should be sacrificed to a sea monster. She waits for Perseus to rescue her. And usually in all these paintings that were done before, Andromeda would be very much afraid, and you would always have sort of the big Perseus rushing for her in order to rescue her. Here we have Andromeda in a very relaxed pose. I mean, she's chained to the cliffs, but the way she looks is almost like a captain on a ship who looks sort of out in the waters to see whether there's a different solution. And maybe this is a reflection of the family she comes from, who, as I said, were all Navy officers. And I'm sure if Hilma af Klint was had been born a man, she would have been a Navy officer too. Thank God she was born a woman. As I said, Hilma af Klint was also a revolutionary in a lot of different ways. And what she now is famous for is less sort of her academic paintings. As I said, she was a very fine academic painter, but she wasn't that outstanding as she was with the kind of painting she did afterwards. So Hilma af Klint was in her early 40s. She was 44 when she broke with the academic tradition and started to do something completely else. That's the first series she did in 1906. It's called Primordial Chaos. And I'm just showing some of them here. And I think some of them are also in the Tate show right now. And this is the kind of painting she would embark on from 1906 onwards. And after that, she would always work in a series. So before she would do sort of single paintings, she did all kind of things, landscapes, portraits, children books, illustration, and so forth. So we also have a vast body of work before she started that. But ever since she began painting in this different mode, she would work in series and would never do single paintings, but always something that sort of belonged together. And I think what's important to understand is also that it was a very different way in which she painted. So one important thing is, I think, is that she was now a medium. She was a painter and a medium, and she received these works from a higher realm. And there I could bring plenty of quotes, but I just bring one. How it started, she wrote in her notebook saying, Amalia offered me the work and I immediately said yes. Oh, sorry, the I is missing. I immediately said yes. So there were these spirits around her that would talk to her, and they would also be the interconnection between the higher realms, the high masters, as she calls them, and her world. And these spirits had names. They were called Amalia, Georg, Gregor, Ananda. So they also came from different cultures. They had Christian names, but they also had Buddhist names. Ananda is the name of Buddha's favorite pupil. And they would talk to her and they offered her the work and she said yes. So I think that's the other important thing to understand, is that it's a mediumistic work, but it's not something she receives as orders, but something that is a dialogue. She is in constant dialogue with these forces, and they guide her through the work that she's starting then. And the other thing is, now I have to move something here so I can see the quote. The other thing is that she worked in a collective. Hilma af Klint was part, and I will tell you more about this, was part of a collective for a long time, from the 1890s onwards, from 1896 onwards, in a collective that was called The Five, and it consisted of 5 women. And they met on a regular basis in order to do seances together, and they would do automatic drawings and also writing together. And with these 5 women, Hilma af Klint spent almost 10 years before she embarked on that new work. But when she embarked on this new work, she had a very close companion who would do everything together with her, Anna Cassel, and we will hear more about her. And then a new collective was built, which finally ended up to be 13 women. So Hilma af Klint was always in a collective of women who helped her with the work and who would do these things together. And I could also, again, bring very many quotes. I just brought one. Hilma af Klint said in one of her notebooks, 2 individuals must travel together, for the path makes it impossible for one person to proceed. So she's a medium and she's doing it in a collective. That is the person I've just mentioned, Anna Cassel. Anna Cassel was also a trained painter. She went with Hilma af Klint to the academy together. She was also part of the collective The Five, and I've brought one of her mediumistic drawings, which is a spiral. And as you can see, this drawing was done in the collective of The Five, and you can also see Anna's name written on it, just below the spiral. And Anna Cassel and Hilma af Klint started this new body of work together, which started in 1906 with the series Primordial Chaos. Anna Cassel also left her own works, which are also part of the archive of the Hilma af Klint Foundation. I'm showing one picture here by Anna Cassel, and there's also a recent book on Anna Cassel's published by Stolpe Verlaget, which can show you the beautiful works Anna Cassel has done. She has she's also a medium, and she's also she also has a very own style, and as you can also see, it's quite different from Hilma af Klint's, but as I said, there are also works where they have collaborated together. So Hilma af Klint and Anna Cassel start this new work. There are more and more women gathering around this, and at the end it will be a collective of 13 women, and Hilma af Klint will go from one series to the other. So that's another series that starts after Primordial Chaos, which is called Eros. This is the beautiful series, just 2 paintings I'm showing here, called The 10 Largest, and I'm showing you youth and adulthood, and they are in the originals are really huge. They are over 3 meters in height. So here we get to the dimensions of barn doors. They are really immersive and really great to look at. This is a series called Evolution. This is a series called Tree of Knowledge. I will speak more about this. This is the series called The Swan. And at this point of time, there was already war in Europe, the World War I. Sweden was neutral, but still Hilma af Klint was very much troubled by it. And she began this series with World War in mind, and also with trying to sort of gather forces in order to put something, or have something against this outbreak of violence and fearful thinking. And as you can see, Hilma af Klint often evolves from something that's figurative to something that's abstract. And this is also part of the Swan series. So you can see it in the Tate Gallery very beautifully, how this sort of evolves from something else into something abstract. And I think also this is Hilma af Klint's definition of abstraction, is that abstraction is the natural expression of the spiritual. And this is, I guess, where the excitement started when Hilma af Klint was rediscovered, to actually realize that the history of abstraction might be something else than we have been told, because the standard account of abstraction is that it was invented by Kandinsky and Mondrian and Malevich around 1910 and around 1911. And Hilma af Klint, as we have just seen, started painting abstract already in 1906. So she embarked on this journey by herself and inspired by spiritual ideas, which is also something that was very important to Mondrian and also to Kandinsky. But as we can see, it started earlier than we thought. And I think in the past there have been other exhibitions, for example, like Georgiana Houghton, who already started painting abstractions in the end of the 19th century. So we're rewriting this canon, and I think it's part of the excitement that is around Hilma af Klint right now. An example for another series called The Dove, and one called Altarpiece. in 1915. From 1906 to 1915, Hilma af Klint paints one series after the other. They are often very different, as you have seen, in style. So with every new series, she also invents a different style. And finally, all these series sum up to 193 paintings. And this entire cycle of paintings, of several series, she calls the paintings for the temple. After that, she doesn't stop painting, but continues. And you can see that certain motifs come again and again. For example, like the spiral, that's something that goes through. This is a spiral from the 1920s. Another one, beautiful spiral from 1922. And I called Hilma af Klint a revolutionary. And, you know, in a way, we should be cautious about these words. What do they really mean? But actually, Hilma af Klint and Anna Cassel in the notebooks in 1906 connect their work to the revolutions that are happening in that time. They write down, the work must be carried forward by the people of the earth. The work refers to liberation from the oppression of the higher classes. And we know that around this time in Russia, there was the first revolution. So they connect to this. And also, I think the other revolution that was going on, and maybe they wouldn't call that a revolution in the political sense, but the other big revolution that was going on was in the natural sciences. And we should not forget that Hilma af Klint lived in Stockholm, and Stockholm had just developed into the center of the natural sciences. The Nobel Prizes were given in Stockholm, and they were also given to a woman in 1903, to Marie Curie, for the discovery of radioactivity, together with her husband and Becquerel. And so that was also a very, that for women to see that was something that was very impressive. There was a lot of agitation also against that. There were a lot of people who didn't want Marie Curie to receive the Nobel Prize for being, they would say, sort of, she's Polish, and also she's a woman and she shouldn't receive it. But in the end, she got it. And I think that was also a big sign for women, that to understand that they could actually, that sort of the door was wide open, and they could make great discoveries, and they could embark on journeys that most people had thought impossible for women. And also, so one thing is, I think that Marie Curie is an important figure in this at this point of time. And the other thing is that Marie Curie also, with talking about radioactivity, discovered things that were invisible for most of the time. So radioactivity is something we cannot see. It has very strong effects. It's a very powerful force. And it's also similar to other invisible forces that were discovered in this time, like X-rays, for example, like the telephone, like radio waves, and so forth. So there was this revolution in the natural sciences that really inspired people to think about the invisible world. And there were the scientists who discovered a lot of things, among them women. And on the other hand, there were the artists, and they had the feeling, we can also see or connect to forces that might not be visible to everyone, but we can channel them and make them visible with our art. And I think that's a movement in the arts, and Hilma af Klint also believed in that. And I brought one picture from Primordial Chaos. I think that makes this kind of telephone era and this area of invisible forces that become visible very, very clear to everyone when you see it. I also brought this painting from Primordial Chaos, and you see a lot of writing on that. And you see that there are two names written on it, Ascot and Vestal. And those are alter egos of Anna Cassel and Hilma af Klint. Hilma af Klint is the Ascot. Anna Cassel is Vestal. And Vestal, they are the ancient priestesses that guard the the temple of the Vestal, whereas Asked is the one who turns his own body into a vessel for the divine and makes his own body into a temple. So it's the outer and the inner side of the temple, and it's Anna Cassel and Hilma af Klint working together and sort of forming this outer and inner temple and forming also a kind of dual organism together. And this is pretty much also something that Hilma af Klint thought that's in the center of her work, is overcoming your ego, overcoming sort of the individual realm and connecting with something else, with someone else, and forming a organism together. So that also leads me to the third chapter, Eros. Eros is a series by Hilma af Klint also. She starts in 1907. Eros, again, is like Andromeda, is a very ancient topic of art history. Usually Eros is shown as the god, often with wings, and beautiful god who falls in love with a half-human woman. This is also how one of Hilma af Klint's contemporaries pictured him. That's a painting by a painter called Kronberg, who was also, as Hilma af Klint, a member of the Theosophical Society. Hilma af Klint joined the Theosophical Society in 1903. Kronberg was also a member, although a different branch of the Theosophical Society, but you can see how revolutionary her art really was. This is something that was done by Kronberg in the very same time as Hilma af Klint's painting. So this is, completely different mindset. And Hilma af Klint writes about Eros. Eros is the fusion of all colors, and it announces, among other things, understanding in love. So there it's kind of chemical reaction on the canvas, and behind it, there's a fusion of colors, and it is about understanding and love. And this fusion of colors, these many pastels you find in her work, is something that also runs through. And that's also something that happens in her life. It's not only something that's on the canvas, but it's a transformation also of her life. Hilma af Klint calls herself, I was the instrument of ecstasy. And I like so much the difference between the photograph and the expression and the posture on the photograph and this quote. I think often these women of the turn of the century don't look like what they were doing, and I love the difference of that you have the freedom to do so many things, or you take yourself the freedom of doing so many things, and then you sit for the photographer and you kind of pose as a woman of the turn of the century. Hilma af Klint had a lot of deep relationships with the women around her and her collectives, and they were also physical love relationships, and we know about it also from notebooks that are in the Hilma af Klint Foundation. And there is particularly one woman who writes about it, whose name is Sigrid Lanseen. She was a gymnastic teacher, and she writes in her notebook in 1913, Hilma slept by me for a while on the morning of July 25th, kissed me incessantly, held my neck so tightly that I saw endless white flowers raining down. And Hilma af Klint again writes about this picture, which she does in 1913, that this painting was inspired by Sigrid Lanseen. So sort of work and life flow into each other and inspire each other. And also there's a lot of symbolism. You see the spiral, you see the snail. The snail actually is a hermaphroditic animal with two sexes. And for Hilma af Klint, the fusion of the sexes is something really important, and the transformation of the dual idea of sexes into one. And it's often symbolized by the colors blue and yellow. Blue and yellow also makes green. Green is a color you find a lot in her paintings, particularly in her early paintings. And often blue stands for the woman and yellow for the man, but it's not fixed. It can also be the other way around. But in general, those two colors stand for the two sexes. So Hilma af Klint developed this vast cosmos of ideas and paintings and how to live and how to transform society in her collective. And for a long time, there was this idea that she didn't want to show this to the public, but as it turns out, this is wrong. She wanted to show her work to the public, to find an audience for her work, and she did so. And she came up with very great ideas of how to do it. And one idea is what I call the museum in a suitcase. So she exhibited her earliest exhibition we know of her spiritual work is in 1913. It looks from the material we have, from the documents we have, as if it was part of a group exhibition of the Theosophical Society, and it looks as if she didn't show any of her abstract works. She showed spiritual works, but not the abstractions. Anna Cassel also exhibited in this very same exhibition. But Hilma af Klint was constantly looking for new places to show her work, and also realized that her work is so vast and huge that it wasn't easy to transport it to other places and also to show it to people. So she made miniature versions of her work, and glued them into 10 blue books. You see them here in the Hilma af Klint Foundation. And these miniature reproductions were miniature watercolors of, for example, this is one of the 10 largest paintings, and black and white photographs. And they are glued on two opposite pages, so you can see them at the same time. And she did this for all the works of the paintings for the temple. And this museum in a suitcase she brought to the Goetheanum in Dornach. Many of you might know that she tried to get the attention of Rudolf Steiner for her work, and she tried to exhibit her works also in Dornach. That's the first Goetheanum that was built by Rudolf Steiner that burned down. Actually, Hilma af Klint was there when it burned down, and then he built a new one. There's also this sort of famous story that Steiner sort of turned her down and heavily criticized there. I don't think that this is what happens, and this is not what the archival material shows. It looks as if he wasn't as much into her work as she wished, but he also gave some commentaries on it, and he didn't seem to discourage her to continue what she was doing. He actually said that her work would be important for the North. So in a way, he sort of kept her in a distance, but he encouraged her to do what she was doing and to continue, although he didn't agree to having it in the Goetheanum. So she brought her museum in a suitcase to Dornach in Switzerland and showed it to Rudolf Steiner. She went with it to Amsterdam in Holland in 1927. And again, she was looking for exhibition spaces. It didn't work out. She had support by another woman who was very much into her work, but couldn't do anything for her. And then she even went, and I think this is important as we are in an English bookshop now, she also went to London in 1928 to exhibit her work, and she went physically. She went herself, had a small exhibition in a place that still exists, the Friends House. Actually, when I was in London in April, I went to visit it. The Friends House, which was run by the Quakers, and they hosted a conference organized by the Anthroposophical Society, and Hilma af Klint was part of it. Here you see the program. And you can see for 4 p.m. exhibition of paintings by Miss Hilma af Klint from Uppsala. She had moved by then. She didn't live in Stockholm anymore, but in Uppsala, with an address. So she even introduced her paintings. But it seems as if she didn't get a lot of responses, and also it seems as if she was disappointed by that. We don't know which works exactly she showed there, but she was talking in a letter exchange between the organizers and herself about the measurements, and it seems like she showed paintings from these late series of her paintings of the temple. What I find absolutely fascinating that she was just in 1928, she was just around the corner from Virginia Woolf, and Virginia Woolf herself was in this year published her famous book Orlando, which is basically about the protagonist is traveling through time and changing the sexes. And this is, he's male in the beginning and female in the end. And this is also, that's what Hilma af Klint and her collective did all the time. They had all these male and female alter egos, and also from all kind of different time periods. So they had this Orlando life, Virginia Woolf imagined in her book. And the other thing is Virginia Woolf was also working on her lectures that were eventually published as under the title A Room of One's Own, in which she wondered whether the two sexes in the mind corresponding to the two sexes in the body, and whether they also require to be united in order to get complete satisfaction and happiness. So Virginia Woolf was sort of obsessed with the same topics Hilma af Klint was interested in, and they were just sort of, a few hundred meters away from each other. Unfortunately, they didn't meet each other in 1928. And in 1929, Virginia Woolf published A Room of One's Own. After, I would say, the London experience, Hilma af Klint realized that maybe the time for her paintings hadn't come yet. She was already approaching her 70s. She was not getting any stronger. She was sort of on her way to turning into an old lady. And she decided that maybe her contemporaries shouldn't have the last word, and that she should save her work for future generations. And this is what she did. So from 1930 onwards, she decided she would not go to Dornach anymore, but she kept the connections to the Anthroposophical Society, but she didn't travel that much anymore. And she decided that her works should only be shown 20 years after her death. And I think this is also, it's a great and bold decision she made, to hand her work on to a future generation rather than saying, oh God, I failed and the contemporaries don't like it. She was sure that the contemporaries were wrong and she was right. So she put the sign +X into almost all her notebooks, and noted down that this sign combination means that her works can only be shown 20 years after her death. And she then worked even more on creating or designing a temple for her paintings of the temple. And now we are in the 1930s. And yeah, the amazing parallel is that at the same time, Hilaire Ribay, whom you see here in a picture, Hilaire Ribay was also working on building and designing a temple for abstract works. She was just much more lucky than Hilma af Klint because she wasn't in Europe in the 30s. Europe wasn't a good place for building new things in the 30s, one has to say. And another world war was approaching. But Hilaire Ribay was in New York. She had Guggenheim to support her ideas and also to give the money for it. And Hilma af Klint and Hilaire Ribay worked together with Frank Lloyd Wright finally to build the Guggenheim Museum that has the spiral form. And most of you will know that Hilma af Klint's paintings were exhibited in the Guggenheim Museum in 2018, a great show curated by Tracy Bashkov and David Horowitz. And so they finally entered the kind of spiral temple she had envisioned. And what's more, Hilma af Klint dreamt of this temple to be built on a small island called Ven, which is in between Denmark and Sweden. And Manhattan is also an island. Hilma af Klint wanted her temple to be open so you could look in the sky from the temple. And that's also what, that there should be an observatory on the top. And this is also something that with the Guggenheim Museum, it also opens to the sky. So there were a lot of parallels. And as you might also know, the Guggenheim exhibition was a huge success. There were 600,000 people coming to see the show, and was the most successful show in the history of the Guggenheim Museum. But again, Hilaire Ribay and Hilma af Klint didn't know of each other, and both were working on sort of separate paths on a very similar idea. And I thought, because Hilma af Klint also dates her ideas a lot, and I thought I might look up what was happening around this time in May. And what I've brought you is a beautiful notebook from 1919, which is called Flowers, Mosses, and Lichens. And it's in spring. It's the first spring after the First World War. And Hilma af Klint really tries to find something to empower mankind again, to put something against this kind of destruction and hate and death that was brought with World War I. And she tries to learn from nature how to sort of recreate, how to grow again. And she does this book called Flowers, Mosses, and Lichens, and she studies several plants, each plant sort of when it flowers, when it sort of comes up, gets green again with spring. And tomorrow, if you go out, you might look for the common ash, and it's, oh God, now I have to put on my glasses in order to read it. The Latin name is Fraxinus excelsior. It's the common ash, and I think in most, you can find it in North America, you can find it all over Europe, you can find it in Asia, and it's a holy tree in a lot of Nordic religions. Hilma af Klint has also painted something similar in her Tree of Knowledge series from 1913. There's Yggdrasil, the Nordic ash, and I think Hilma af Klint also draws from that in her Tree of Knowledge series. And again, I looked it up today. The ash is a very surprising or great plant. It has helicopter seeds that go down in spirals. Most of the trees are unisexual trees, so they are male and female at the same time. They can also be male or female, and they can change sex with age, which is also something that Hilma af Klint would have liked. And Hilma af Klint connects it with certain capacities, and she writes, and that's in German. And I translate it. She writes in the writing you see below this small diagram. She writes that it's simmering with unreserved Lebenskraft, life power, simmering with unreserved life power, and that it's and it's doing so in a straight simplicity. So that's kind of the characteristic she tries to learn from the ash. And there's another, and it's dated May 19th. So tomorrow is the day of the common ash, and you might try to connect with it wherever you are. And another plant she studied was Viburnum, which you can see in this beautiful diagram. And Viburnum for her, that is the 18th of June. So it's this day, next month. And for her, Viburnum carries the power of disobedience, ungehorsam. And this morning I looked outside, and actually there is a Viburnum tree in the garden where I was staying. So this is what I call good luck. And so I close here. Hilma af Klint dreamt of a museum to show what lies behind the forces of matter. She called it a temple, she called it a museum, and it was an inward and an outward museum, something that she hoped we would build one day, and also something that we would sort of build in ourselves. And with that, I close. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's a great question. I would say, I guess we should do both. On the one hand, I think the way in which abstraction was discussed 40, 50 years ago, or let's say even in the 1960s, when abstraction became a success story, in retrospect, was also in a way limited. We know, I mean, Kandinsky, for example, didn't define himself as a medium, but he was also very much interested in the spiritual and in sort of a kind of spiritual transformation of the world, or the society he lived in. And that's something that didn't really have a place in a kind of Cold War abstraction canon. So with rediscovering Hilma af Klint, we can also rediscover a kind of abstraction that was sidelined in the Cold War or in art history. And also, I think it takes us back to a tradition that has been for a long time very strong in art history, because art history in the beginning, was spiritual, Christian, or other religions, Buddhist art. And I think it's also a great way to sort of think about abstraction in this line. And then you're absolutely right. There's also the context of theosophical art, of spiritual art, and we can also put it in that. I mean, people like Georgiana Houghton, for example, who was also a medium here in London, who exhibited her works in 1871 for the first time on Bond Street. She got a beautiful exhibition in the Coteau Institute some years ago. And that is the context of spiritual art. But in a way, I think we shouldn't. The great thing about art is a house with many entrances, and I think we shouldn't separate the different ways of approaching art too much. And in a way, we can, by entering through Hilma, we can learn something about artists from Kandinsky to Georgiana Houghton. And by entering through abstraction, we can also open the doors for people who might not be inclined to see a spiritual art show. I think, for example, for me, I'm a traditionally trained art historian, and for me, the abstraction in the beginning was something that attracted me, and it drew me into this spiritual context. I'm very happy to discover now. Actually, it was off-putting in the beginning for me, I have to say. So when I started this, I didn't know a lot about this, and I thought in the beginning, I was kind of disappointed, because I thought, oh, here we have this great artist, such a bold female artist, and then she claims that she's not doing herself, but she's actually guided by these invisible spirit forces. And I was kind of disappointed until I realized that these forces are kind of like invisible friends, rather than sort of an institution that gives orders. And that sort of made me curious. And now I like this entire cosmos, but I had my prejudice before that, and it took me some time to enter this. And I think, yes, in the past, there were a lot of people who were very much put off by this, and it didn't even take the time to try to understand more about this, and wanted to exclude her for that, absolutely, from the canon. I mean, in a way, it's sort of the entire idea that sort of the canon of abstraction should be spoiled by this Swedish woman, this Swedish spiritual witch, was something that a lot of male critics found really off-putting. But I think now we are much more relaxed with different spiritual practices and belief systems. And everybody does some yoga, and most people don't belong to an institutionalized church anymore. People feel like you can have all kinds of spiritual experiences. And maybe there's also Harry Potter, who has sort of, I don't know, added to the excitement about kind of magical beliefs or whatever. So people now can deal with that. But I think for a long time, it was really difficult to talk about this. Yes. It's a very good question. Where did it go? I mean, I have the feeling it was sort of in the Theosophical Society, in a way, was a very bold society. It was the only kind of religious society that would allow women to all hierarchical ranks. So it was founded by a woman, Blavatsky. The highest rank was Annie Besant, and so forth. So, the Catholic Church wouldn't do, until now, doesn't allow women to be priestesses. And the Protestant Church also in this time was not open to this idea. Science wasn't open to this idea. All kinds of, and also art wasn't open to this. The genius was still reserved for men. So the Theosophical Society really was kind of a liberation religion for women, and they were for a time very successful. Good question. Where did it go? I have the feeling that around 90, it was something a lot of people toyed with, and then maybe with the First World War, and maybe also with sort of the rise of psychology, I have the feeling that this talking about the spiritual was seen as something weird and crazy, rather as a kind of deviant approach to higher realms that everybody believed in. I mean, the entire 19th century was very religious. So maybe the rise of psychology and the First World War destroyed it, but I don't know. Maybe you know better. I mean, you have a full bookstore devoted to that. And also she also joined the Anthroposophical Society and also stayed in that. And also and Blavatsky, I mean, Steiner is the one who's always, I mean, in the 1920s and 30s, he's everywhere in her notebooks, and always Dr. Steiner. So it's always very respectful. But Blavatsky comes back again, also in the 1940s in her notebooks. So yes, they both stay with her. I would say this idea of having these kind of, of having these invisible spirits that talk to you, that's something unique. I don't see that Steiner has a kind of Ananda or Gregor or whatever besides him, but she also talks to a lot of deceased people, which is also interesting. And the older she gets, the more she talks to people who are dead, and also to the dead Steiner, she talks a lot. And that's also interesting because they get on very well. Once he's dead, they get on very well. And they're very close. They found a university together, a spiritual university. And he also advises her when painting her watercolors. He advises her and say, why don't you color it in this color or in that color? So he's very present then. Yeah. I mean, this is also that's something all over in your bookstore, right? I mean, this is such an old spiritual idea that the duality of the sexes we have to overcome it, and then there is the hermaphrodite, the divine hermaphrodite that combines the two sexes. I mean, and I think all religions think of the highest deity as a person of, or an entity of both sexes. And so, yeah, that's very present from the very beginning. There are all kind of allegories and signs and symbols that connect to this idea, and something that is also sort of behind the canvas that is lived. So they have these physical relationships in which Hilma of Klint often is a male entity. I mean, for example, she is Asked, but also later on she will be St. George. And the union of the women is thought of as this combination of the two sexes. And I think, I mean, Hilma af Klint for her times is absolutely extraordinary. I can completely understand that she didn't even expect her contemporaries to understand. And I think it was beyond what people could conceive. If you think of the way women were supposed to be and men were supposed to be, and how they dressed. And she even speaks about this. She says that often there are female people who dress as men and and the other way around. So she had the feeling not she is the one who's confused about the sexes, but her time is completely confused about the sexes. And this kind of reversal, I think, is something she could only do because she shared this this completely transformative belief system and way of seeing the world with these women around her. And they even they built together. They built a studio on a small island close to Stockholm in a lake. And they lived and worked there. And there were also times where Hilma af Klint sort of imagined there would be kind of a research unit there and sort of redefine everything. And I think this, for women, it was a bit, maybe even a bit easier than for men to, to share rooms and to share houses, to do a lot together and to also be intimate together, because in a way people were less suspicious of them than they were of men. And so, so there was this entire collective that completely transformed the world they lived in. And I think the beautiful thing is that they also embraced modernity around them. So in the beginning, when I started this, the idea was pretty much that Hilma af Klint was this kind of isolated, remote, witch-like person. But actually, I mean, she seems to be very social. So she had this collective around her. There were all kinds of tensions, but I think this is normal. And so they, built new collectives and, had tensions about how to do it and so forth, but they were always in a group. And she did a lot of normal things or exciting things people would do in that time. Normal things like, I don't know, going to the movies. She went to see Quo Vadis, which is, with Sigrid Landsén, which is a movie about ancient Rome and a love story there. She had a telephone book full of addresses and telephone numbers. She traveled to Italy. She took all kind of notes. She had like a giant library and so forth. So I think in a way, Hilma af Klint was, and I think that's the fascinating thing about her, that she had this, on the one hand, this kind of self-sustained, normal, rooted life with which she could carry on until she was an old woman. That it had this kind of magical spiritual side, that she produced this wonderful artworks, but that she was, living also a kind of, modern life in a big city, going by public transport and, with everything that's kind of normal in these days. Dedicates an entire series to the atom, and the atom is in the center of all these discourses you have just mentioned, and the idea that suddenly that people realized, oh, the atom can be split. The atom is not the last unbreakable thing in science, but it can be split. And also that the elements can transform into something else, which almost sounds like alchemy. And actually, when Pierre Curie talks about it, he also refers to that and says, oh, this is what the alchemists always dreamt about, that elements can be transformed. And suddenly with radioactivity, they discovered, oh, this is actually what happens with radioactive elements. They transform. So nothing is stable, everything transforms, everything sort of connects and splits and so forth. And this is something that I think is kind of the powerhouse for Hilma af Klint, for her ideas, because I don't see it as, and I think this is also the difference maybe to Theosophy and Anthroposophy. It's not like Hilma af Klint introduces a belief system that is there to replace the old one, but she introduces a movement, which is sort of, you connect with something and then you transform, and then something else comes up and you connect again and then you transform. So it's a lifelong transformation that never stops. And I think that's the beauty about it, because it's zero ideological, it's zero kind of, you have to do this, you have to do that, but it's, try to connect with things and you will see how it transforms you. because I think for her, and this is also probably very much a difference to people who define themselves as avant-garde. I think her idea is pretty much that she brings something back that has always been there but has been sort of forgotten, and she reconnects that with science and sort of the new things that are going on, but she doesn't feel like, you know, time is kind of just going in one direction, but it's a circle, and that what she is doing is bringing something back that is ancient. And she wouldn't see herself, I don't know what, you know, it's not avant-garde, it's kind of, it's revolutionary, but in a kind of ancient, bringing back ancient things. Yeah, no, this is beautifully said. And I'm sure sort of in your bookshop, I should really spend more time there. One thing, there's one painting I showed from 1913 that where she says sort of it was inspired by Siegfried Lonsen. You have the chakras. I know almost nothing about chakras, but I'm sure sort of if I spend more time in your bookshops or speaking to you, I would understand more about this. And as you also said, all kind of symbols that come up in her work are also very, very ancient symbols, cosmological symbols. And I think, you know, I don't think that everything is symbolism in her work. So I don't think like, you know, we could decode at some point her work. But there are a lot of things at the same time, her paintings. So there are symbols, there are messages, they have biographical layers, there are portals, they open something up for us. And you know, they're also great paintings from an art historical point of view. And there are so many different layers. And I'm sure that, that there are also all kind of influences that I, as an art historian, could not detect. But for example, people who are very familiar with images of chakras and know the history of these paintings would also maybe see possible forerunners in paintings she had done. You can find me on you. I think if you just Google me, you will also. I'm at I teach at a university called Leuphana, Leuphana, and there you find me on the website. But you can also just write to me over Instagram. That's also fine. And I'm not Julia Voss on Instagram. I'm Spiral Temple on Instagram. Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye bye.